So last week you saw a Minecraft bot video, and I want to say that there are a lot of them coming soon. I wanted to make this video to show how I code these things because I code them myself. So all this stuff is written in Java. So essentially this is the code of the plugin that made the Minecraft bot 100 blocks to get a random potion effect video possible. So I'm gonna break it down. So every single spigot plugin has this line, essentially public class main. That's what every single Java thingy has. That's the thing of it. And extends Java plugins, and in spigot there's a thing called listener, and I used it to essentially detect when I move and etc. Also, every single spigot plugin has this. It's what runs when the server enables and when the server disables. If that wouldn't be here, I think it would just spit out errors. This is what makes running commands possible. Essentially, this checks if the command that was written is challenge, and if it's not a player, then it says, bro, you console, get the fuck out of here. And it basically returns true, and return true, we just like stops, so it doesn't run all of this code. So after we check that the sender is indeed a player, it grabs them into a variable, and args length, it's basically arguments, what you put after the command field, like slash challenge, and this is the arguments. So if the length of it is 0, essentially like no arguments whatsoever. It spits out like the commands that you can like run, and if it's 1, so essentially like slash challenge, and there's like only one thing thingy here, and no like after that, it runs this. So if this thingy is on, it turns the toggle variable that is like basically used to, every single time a player moves when the challenge is not even on. And the counter, but basically what's the counter for? It's steps. And we have the steps command, the counter variable does the thingy for that. So it basically sends the title like this on the screen. It adds effects so the player is blind, he cannot see shit, and he cannot move essentially, because that looks cool. That's what it should be. And it stops. If it's off, this thingy, then it toggles everything off. Sets the counters to 0, sends the title thank you for playing in green text, removes every single effect that the player has, and returns true, so stops. If this is debug, so it checks if the debug thingy is off, then it turns it on, and it spits out a message in the chat that says debug mode on, and it stops. If the debug mode was already on, then it turns it off and spits out the message that it's off, stops. And of course, if it's this thingy not of it, then it says like, what can it do actually? Okay, then if the command is like slash steps, it checks if the sender is the console. If it's not, spits out, returns, then it grabs them into a variable. And if the challenge is off, then it says like the challenge is off, error, and type of shit. So if the length of the arguments is just 0, yes. And it spits out a message in the chat that says the steps like 3 out of 100 and returns. Then if it's like this, basically the argument's length is 1. If it's like steps, for example, steps all or steps total, it's checked by this. Essentially, if it's not that, then it spits out like that. You have to write this. And of course, if it's that, then it spits out the total counter. Let's look at the listener. Basically, this checks if the challenge is even on, and if it's not, it returns, it stops. Then if it's essentially on, it continues. So it gets the location from to, and it gets the coordinates. Essentially, what this returns is like, for example, like this. It's a double, so it has a point in between. This basically splits it. This just essentially makes it a string, splits it by the dot, grabs this one, because this basically returns a list, which is like basically 35, like this, and index is 0, basically like returning this, and it makes it into an integer. It does that with the from X and Z and the to X and Z. Basically, I did not have the Y thingy in there because it kind of bugged and basically returned the wrong Y for from. Then it checks if the X1 and X2 are the same, and then it checks Z1 and Z2 basically if I'm on the same block. And if it is, it returns, it stops. And if the counter is 100, then it spits out in the chat time for random potion effect. And then it does this. This is essentially my favorite part. Basically, it generates a random number from 0 to 22, I believe, yes. And this is a switch statement. Essentially, this is like if else, but like more advanced, less stupid, and more fast. And all of this, this whole switch statement, it determines which one the player gets. So if it's 0, he gets speed for like, this is the amount of ticks it's for. Like in Minecraft, there are 20 ticks per second, so this is essentially like half a minute. And then the amplifier, essentially it starts from 0, which basically like, if the amplifier was 0, then it would be like just speed 1. But as it's the amplifier is 1, then it's speed 2, etc, 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 all of this, all of that. It makes the counter 0 and it essentially stops, returns. If the debug is on, then it spits out the amount of steps determined by the counter, the X and the Z, and it adds to the counter and the total counter. Basically, yeah, that's the plugin.